Alright, so we're going to trim today, and one of the things to know about trimming is that you should never try to trim until your pot is not flexible. If I can do this and it's not going to bend, if you're trying to trim and your pot's still really soft, what's going to happen is you're going to distort the form and you're going to be really disappointed, and you might even completely destroy the piece. So you got to make sure that it's at a point where it's not going to bend when you push on it a little bit, but it still needs to be wet. If it's really dry, you're not going to be able to trim it. It needs to be able to peel out as you use these trimming tools and sort of peel the clay out and not come off in shavings because it's so dry. So you got to keep an eye on your pots. You got to check them. You got to come in and look at them and see how they're doing. And also, I mean, I don't know if I probably didn't talk about this last time, but you have to wrap them up in plastic to keep them from drying too fast, especially if you're going to be away for a couple of days. You don't want to leave your pots out to dry because then they'll be way too dry to trim. So this is a tricky thing. You have to sort of get a feel for when is it a good time to trim my pot. Another thing before you start is to feel the thickness of the bottom. If you don't do that, you don't have any idea really how much clay you have right here that you can remove without cutting through into the pot. So I'm feeling it, and I feel like, you know, I have a good amount of clay here so that I can do the kind of foot I like to cut. I like to cut a nice foot. Some people will just smooth the bottom. They don't leave very much clay down there, but I personally like to see a nice foot on the bottom of a pot, and that's just my preference. And that's what I like to ask my beginners to do, at least in their first throwing assignments, is to do a nice foot on the bottom. Now, another thing that helps you with this wheel is it has concentric rings in it. You may not be able to see that in the video, but it has rings cut into the head of the metal head of the wheel that help you to line up your pot, because you're going to turn it upside down and try to line it up in the middle of the wheel. Okay. Now you do that as best you can before you even start. And it's really important at this point. Make sure your pedal is all the way off before you turn your wheel on, because if you have something sitting there, it can just fly off and destroy itself, and I've done that more than once. Now, in terms of trim tools, I want to make a point, you know, don't ever use these. These are for carving on the surface and decoration and detailing when you're, these are thin wire, and they're not designed for trimming. They're going to break. You're going to bend them, you're going to break them, you're going to wreck them. So these are not for trimming, okay? These are for ornamentation. I've seen too many people destroy these trying to trim with them. What I like to use are the triangles, but other people will use lots of different other ones. And if you're trimming, for example, the inside of a form or the curve of a form, you might want a circle. So there's different reasons for wanting other kinds of tools. There's also these knife tools. They look like a bent knife, and they're pretty nice too. So I'm going to show you how this works as well. I always end up back with these triangles. This is where I'm at in terms of what I like to use, but you might like some very different tools. We have a whole selection of different shapes that you can try out and decide what you like. But I like to have a larger one for the bigger cuts, and I like to have the little one for the middle of the foot. And I'll show you that as we go. You'll see what I'm choosing to use. All right, so it's mostly centered, but we wanted to get it perfectly centered. So I've got my pedal turned off. I'm going to turn my wheel on. And what you're going to do is you're going to take your needle tool and you're going to hold it fairly firmly. I'll put it over here so you can see. And you're just going to move slowly in until it catches on the pot. It's going to catch on one part of the pot, and you're going to see a cut there. That means that that is further out than the rest of the pot from the center. So I'm going to slide it just a tiny bit towards the middle from there, erase the line, and then try again. Okay, so it's mostly catching all the way around now, so I'm just going to hold it where it is, erase those lines as best I can with my finger. And now I'm going to try not to move it at all. now that I've got it kind of centered. And I'm going to take some clay, and this clay, this is called tamping clay. This clay doesn't have to be the same clay you used to throw with. It can be any clay, and I like to use actually sculpture clay because it's less likely to stick to the pot. It's less sticky than throwing clay. It's got more sand in it. So I like to use sculpture clay to press down and attach the form to the wheel. And it's basically, think about it, it's almost like you're hand building where you're attaching the pot to the wheel with this tamping clay. Be generous with tamping clay. You don't have to just put little tiny pieces on there because you may end up with a piece coming off the wheel because you didn't use enough tamping clay. So I usually put it in 3 different spots. Around the pot, just to make sure that it's not going to shift from center. Now the reason you want to have it so centered is so that it lines up with the lip of the pot, because you're going to trim here and not down here. So what you want is for it to be trimming to the center here that matches the center there, and so it's nice and balanced. Also, I talked about when I was throwing about making sure that the lip of the pot is level, and if you didn't do that, you can always have it the other way on the wheel, tamp it down, centered, and then take that off with a needle tool and make sure that the top is level. Because if you turn it over and it's crooked, you're going to do a crooked foot. It's not going to line up with the lip of the pot, and it's going to get pretty wonky. So you're going to make sure that the pot is level and that it's properly centered. Okay. Now this nice blade tool can be used for cleanup. I usually use it for big dirty work, like just getting all the big lumpy stuff off from the bottom, from where you cut it from the wheel, and where you handled it, where it sat on the board. So just kind of smoothing that down. And I know that I have extra clay right here at the top, so I can take some of that off and shape the bowl a little bit, even make it a little bit rounder and cleaner as a form. Okay. So I like to use this kind of tool for that work. And it's a nice sharp tool. It's kind of like a knife. Now I like to do my detail work with the triangles. And I want to have a nice level spot out here. Now when you're cutting a foot, don't make the mistake of making your foot all the way in here. You want the foot all the way out to the edge of the pot. Let me smooth that out a little bit. More out here. Because if you have a foot that's all the way in here, it's going to make your pot wobbly when it sits on the table. And if you think about, if you're going to have anything in it, it's going to make it heavier. It's going to be even more tippy. So put your foot all the way out here, not in here. Okay, so I'm planning on my foot being out here. I'm kind of leveling it there with the tool. And now I'm going to decide exactly where that is. This is the next thing you want to do. You don't want to cut the middle until the end. You want to cut out here, decide where the edge of your foot is, the shape of your foot. The outer edge is going to be defined out here. This is where I like to use a triangle because it has a nice corner. And then sort of round it back from there down the form. But I'm cutting the side of my foot right here. Okay, so you can see the edge of the foot is right there. Get myself a level spot for the foot there. Make it nice and flat. Okay, now I'm ready to cut out the middle. And I'm thinking my foot, for this size of a pot, you kind of think about the thickness of the pot. And so I'm going to sort of mark where the edge of that foot is. It's about the same thickness as the pot. So I'm going to go to that line from the middle with this smaller triangle. You start at the middle, come out, and trim to that edge. So you see my foot's right here. I'm going to take out the center. Now I know that I have a little bit of thickness here to work with, so I can make a deep foot. One of the things to think about when you're cutting a foot is that a foot can be a great way of controlling where your glaze goes when you're in the glaze room. If you have a foot that lifts the piece off the table, so you think about when it's in the kiln, it's got to sit on a kiln shelf where you can't have any glaze where it sits on the kiln shelf, and if the foot is sticking out far enough, you can glaze the bottom of your pot. Okay, you can't have glaze on anything that touches the kiln, but if you have a foot sticking out above the floor of the pot like this, that part can be unglazed, but the bottom of your pot can get glaze on it. So I can glaze in here if I have a foot. Now if the whole bottom is flat, and if the whole bottom is sitting on the kiln shelf, none of that can have glaze on it. So this is a reason for a foot. Also, a lot of people like to have a foot, especially on something that's going to have food that might be hot, because it lifts it away from your table. The heat of the container is not going to affect your table. It's going to be lifted away from it. Okay, so I'm just going to clean it up a little bit more. Just kind of give it an edge. Make sure this is pretty flat. But again, you know, when I throw, I always try to leave enough clay in the bottom of the piece so I can do this. I can have this carving out, so I can have a foot that lifts the piece off the table and lifts, especially for me, I think more about being able to lift it off the kiln floor so that I can glaze the bottom of my piece. Just kind of clean it with the sponge a little bit. Make sure you don't have any sharp edges. Round off those edges a little bit after trimming. Make sure there's no sharp edges, because in fact, once this is fired, it's going to get really hard, and you actually could have a sharp edge that you could actually cut yourself on if you don't smooth it out. Okay, so that's basically how you trim. I think I'm going to cut this foot just a little bit more. It's a little short, looks a little short to me. So I'm going to just take a little more clay out. And that's another thing, you know, if you don't feel like you trimmed enough, when you take your pot off the wheel, you can always put it back on and trim it again. In fact, when I make a really large bowl, I usually do an initial trim and then I take it off when it starts to wobble a little bit, let it dry some more, trim it again. So if you're going to put it back on, what you're going to do the second time is you're going to center with your needle tool at the foot, because you don't want to have to redo the foot. The foot is the thing that you're going to center. Okay? All right. So that's a trimmed piece. And at this point, when you put it away, you don't want to put it back on this dirty board over here. You're going to want to set it the way it is now, upside down, on some clean newspaper, probably in the drying room, or on a board that has a piece of clean newspaper on top of it. Okay? You don't want to, at this point, you don't want to get crumblies in the lip of your pot from a dirty board. Okay? So take care of it, keep it clean now. And right now is a good time also to get rid of those marks you made with your needle tool. So you don't have to do it with sandpaper later. Do it now. Do all the cleaning you can do as you go along. It's easier to do it sooner than it is to do it later. It's more work to do it later. Get my needle marks off. Now I have seen people stick their pots down with a little bit of water, and that usually works better with porcelain because it's stickier, but I don't trust it enough to do it myself. But it's something you can try as you get more advanced, and maybe if you're using porcelain clay. But this is really, the tamping clay is really the best way to do this. Okay, so there's our trimmed bowl. And I'm gonna just, this is where you want this cutting tool just to carve your initials in the bottom.